Well, hey there, and welcome to episode number 523 of 6 Pixels of Separation, the Mirum Podcast. My name is Mitch Joel. It's Sunday, July 17th, 2016. Let's get on with the show. So who are you and what do you do?
I am Maria Konnikova, and I am a writer. I write about all sorts of different stuff, psychology, culture, and most recently, con artists.
Love it. The Confidence Game. Great, great book.
Thank you so much. It was, I want to say it was a lot of fun writing it, and it was, but it was also really disturbing. And I have to catch myself all the time in conversations where I'm like, oh my God, this guy was so cool. And then I have to say, wait, let's back up a second. He's a terrible human being. He ruined a lot of lives. A lot of really bad stuff happened. But there's something about it that just keeps drawing you in, and is so fascinating that it's really difficult to maintain that perspective and realize we're dealing with criminals.
Well, there's something alluring about what you're saying, and I think I understand where you're going, which is it feels to me like there's something in the zeitgeist about exploring the other side of mystery psychology lately for years. And I know you've written about Sherlock Holmes, and you have a fascination with him as well because we were connected through Scott Monty, who loves that as well. But it does feel to me that whenever we looked at the darker side of the world, we tended to slide more towards the people trying to stop it or the people who are trying to solve it. But recently, there is this sort of like uncovering of the other side. Who are these people? Why do they do it? What can we learn from them? And I could see how that when you're an ethical person or a person of moral, that there's something icky about uncovering it, even though you want to go further and further along with it.
Right, right. No, that's definitely true. And I think you just have to acknowledge that, as human beings, we're fascinated by certain things that are icky. I mean, there's a reason, and I'm not equating con artists with this, but there's a reason that there were public executions and people would come to them and there would be crowds. You wanted a front row seat. I mean, that's terrible, right? You think about it and you say, what kind of a person wants to do that? Well, think about, what's the latest traffic jam you were ever stuck in?
Rubbernecking.
Exactly, exactly. People are slowed down. They're like, oh, there was an accident. What happened? We are drawn to those types of things, and crime, I think, fits into that to a certain extent. But ultimately, I think the reason why I was okay with this in this particular instance is that I wrote the book for the victims. I wrote it so that people would be empowered to come forward, so that it would kind of destigmatize what it means to be a victim of a con artist. That you understand, these are not stupid people. These are not gullible people. These are not greedy people. These are humans. We're all human, and all humans have these sorts of traits that can, in the right circumstances, make you vulnerable. And I think understanding the con artists, understanding their minds, understanding how they're able to do what they do, I think that helps us potentially protect ourselves, and certainly, I hope, helps us understand why it's not crazy that people fall for con artists. I hate the victim blaming that goes on around victims of con artists. They're not afforded the same courtesy as victims of violent crimes, as victims of burglaries, as victims of other types of crimes, because you say, oh, well, you must have been, how stupid were you? Or, oh, you must be so greedy, or you must be this, you must be that. Right away, we put them down. The word sucker is such a terrible word. Nobody wants to be a sucker. I don't want to be a sucker. So I really, I felt okay kind of delving into the ickiness, because at the end I felt that the payoff was worth it.
So I want to cycle back because I want to come back to that exact world of. I used to do a lot of training in self-defense, like really combative
Mm-hmm.
street stuff. And there was
Mm-hmm.
my teacher who was he would always say that a fight is 97% psychology, 3% physical, and that
Mm-hmm.
most of the fight in the 97%. It's not that it's happening when it's physical. It doesn't happen. The 3% is when it goes physical. So I want to come
Right.
back and talk about that sort of victim victor mindset because I think
Yep.
that's super critical. But it's not like you're an individual who is a writer. You've written for the New Yorker. You were a producer, Charlie Rose. So there's that sort of journalism writing thing in
Mm-hmm.
you. But there's also the academic in you. And the academic
Mm-hmm.
in you is a Harvard graduate, magna cum laude. You are PhD in psychology from Columbia. My mother would be very proud to have you as a daughter. Um, so there's also this academic part of you. And I'm guessing when I look at what you did at Harvard and what you studied at Columbia, there was something going on either then or before that was pushing you in this direction of mystery, psychology, culture. What was going on in your like what was that journey for you?
It's a really interesting question, and I think it starts kind of in childhood, really, because I've always been fascinated by fiction. I mean, I'm a fiction reader. I think it's funny to say that since I obviously write so much nonfiction, but to me, that's always kind of driven me, and I've always wanted to understand, what makes people work, but kind of deeper motivations. And I think that if you start looking at the intersection of fiction and psychology, you start seeing where kind of crime and motivation and kind of what makes people act the way that they do comes out. Because I don't just want to understand, why does someone donate to charity? I really want to understand what makes people tick. And I think, and the world is messy, and I think the reasons I love fiction is that it doesn't attempt to be neat. At least good fiction, great fiction doesn't. It shows the world in all its messiness, that good people do really terrible things, and great people have terrible things happen to them, and we're not black and white. It's not like people are good or bad. We have a lot of different aspects, and in the right circumstances, most anyone can turn to crime. I really deeply believe that. So I think that it was a long time coming. And obviously, I grew up in the Soviet Union, so that's not a society where there's a lot of trust. And at the time, it really was the Soviet Union. This was before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and you have people, backstabbing. You have people being really afraid to talk to one another. You have this constant atmosphere of fear. And it's a country of criminals, by the way. It's a country that's really run by criminal minds. And so I think it still is today. And so when you're growing up in that kind of atmosphere, I think that also kind of makes you very sensitive to that, makes you want to understand it. So I think a lot of these threads kind of came together. What I ended up eventually being about. And I'm also really interested in language, and language as not just as a means of expression, but as a means of thinking. So English is my second language. I didn't speak any English when I came here, so I think it's also a theme that's really permeated my work, and that I think also talks to, I think, your question, because what's the criminal language? How do our words actually reflect who we are, what we're trying to say? So that's how I would answer that. But there's really, I wish I could draw you a to B to C path that would say, like, well, this motivated me to do this. And maybe that exists, but I haven't been able to find it.
But there seems to be a very direct link, at least when I look at the body of work that you're doing, and even the work that you're doing now in the New Yorker, between so here's a story, and when you understand how people think and how they internalize and how they tell
Mm-hmm.
themselves stories and how they then process those stories and then create that persona that they give to the world, when you understand that, it feels to me not that it's easier to tell a story that's going to captivate them, but it is
Mm-hmm.
understanding the sort of the factory, if you will, of the mind and how it will operate to make those stories connect more to people. Like there does seem to be that in how you operate.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you phrased it incredibly well. I don't know if I can improve on that. But yes, yes, I think that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true.
So let's go back and talk a little bit about the victims and the mindset. Whenever something happens, there's no doubt that there's a tremendous amount of shame.
Mm-hmm.
Shame happens across any point of violation that people feel. And I think that you're very salient in saying that, when it's a physical crime, it's, we see it. When it's a psychological
Right.
crime, we can imagine it. But when it's something that somebody, we'll call it willfully, because I'm not even sure if that's the right word, I'm sure you'll correct me on that, partakes in something and then becomes a victim in, it's easy to go to the sort of like the end point would be soccer, but it's less easier for people to have empathy because you feel like there was a willingness to do this. And again, going back to self-defense, I did a lot of
Mm-hmm.
training with women, and it was the whole
Mm-hmm.
thing of, RT, when we taught, it was never about what you dress, what you wore, what types of jewelry you had, the type of car you drove, the type of, because that's a false narrative for being like that
Right.
doesn't entitle you to be a victim.
Right.
And so talk a little bit about is it just that part where because people willfully step forward instead of running away that makes it such a hard thing for victims?
I think that that is part. I think that that's definitely part of the explanation, because I mean, all cons require the victim to be complicit to some extent. What people don't realize is that you can be complicit without really realizing it. That being complicit in a con is the same as, trusting your next door neighbor to take care of your cat while you're gone and not steal anything from the apartment. Like we have these sorts of interactions all the time. Our world is built on trust, and I write about this in the book, and it's a point that I do want to bring up one more time because I think it's so important, and people don't really understand this. Trust is really evolutionarily beneficial, and trust is good, and trust actually helps people get ahead. So when you look at the data, you see that societies with higher levels of generalized trust are more economically evolved. They have better social institutions. They're just better places to be. If you look at individuals with higher levels of trust, they tend to be more intelligent, they're better educated, they have better life outcomes, healthier, happier, all sorts of good stuff. And it makes sense because you can't survive as a lone wolf. I mean, humans need social bonds. We need to trust one another to get ahead. So, on the one hand, we might understand that. On the other hand, you say, yeah, but you were complicit. No, you weren't. You trusted. And that's not a bad thing. So I think that's the first part. Seeing that complicity, like you said, is definitely something that makes it easier to victim blame because we don't understand it as trust. We see it as you're complicit in a criminal enterprise. I think the other part of it is we on some level, I think we have to understand that we're vulnerable because otherwise we wouldn't spend so much time throwing up defense mechanisms that persuade us that we could never fall for it. Because that's, I think, the other part of the story. The reason that we're so mean to victims and that we say things like, you can't fool an honest man, or, oh, they were so greedy, is because then we can draw a line between them and me.
I know, yeah.
And you can say, I'm not greedy. I'm not selfish. I'm not stupid. I'm not gullible. I'm not these things that I'm saying that this person is. I'm honest. So you can't fool me. I can't be them. And it's a false division, but there's some psychological safety in it. Because if you think about like violent crime, you can actually pinpoint exactly what happened. Oh, you were walking on this block that you shouldn't have been walking on, or oh my god, this really could happen to me. But you can see like, well, I'll carry pepper spray, I'll do this, I'll do that. How do you protect yourself against a con? You can't wrap your mind around it in quite the same way. So I think you draw these false barriers instead.
But is the randomness of it too, where like, you're walking and you get mugged, and there's random plus
Mm-hmm.
immediacy plus short
Yep.
time that we
Yep.
all go, these are the three things, right? It was random, it was immediate, it
Yep.
took place in 4 seconds. The problem with the
Mm-hmm.
con is that it may or may not be random. It may
Yep.
or right because you could be a mark and you could just be
Yep.
someone who's been set up for it. It may or
Absolutely.
may not be immediate. It could take place over a
Mm-hmm.
longer period of time. Like there's a lot of I feel like there's almost like a stretching of that timeline of a violent
Yes.
crime that makes it that much more dramatic, harder for everyone else to believe that whole honest person versus
Yep.
and and then also the like, how long do you go along before you're either dropping anchor and believing it or cutting rope and bailing. And everyone thinks they have that understanding of that line that you discussed, but most of us don't.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. I mean, nobody wants to think, with very few exceptions, that they're a victim, that they could be a victim. Everyone wants to say, we're so good at analyzing other people's situations. We're so good at like pointing, oh, this is where you went wrong. I can't believe you didn't see that. We're so good at saying, oh, I would have seen this, I would have seen that, I would have seen this. But we don't realize that you're only objective when it's not happening to you. You can't be objective when it is happening to you.
But is that fully true? And I'm asking this because as you're speaking, I'm thinking about a victim
Mm-hmm.
versus magic tricks. So I love magic. I'll show somebody
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
video of
So
these
do I.
amazing magicians on Instagram, and
Mm-hmm.
they will show you how the trick is done. I will
Yep.
see how the trick is done. I'm smart, you're smart, the people I'm showing are smart, and we'll look at the trick again. And the truth is, even though you know how the trick is done, you are still fooled again. And I feel like
Absolutely.
there's this huge gap that people don't understand between even knowing how it's done and still when you see it, you have to be able to admit to yourself, I'm still fooled by it. The eyes are, the
Yes.
mind isn't operating at the same speed as the eyes, what hand eyes. I mean,
Yep.
you're still victim of it no matter what, even though you know how it's being done and you know it's magic.
Yep, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And magic works no matter how much. If you're a good magician, you explain the trick. I mean, the Penn and Teller cup and balls trick, they use clear cups. So you can always see what's going on, and yet it's still mesmerizing. And I think that there's something very profound in that. I love that you brought up magic because a lot of the principles are the same, and we're okay with it in magic because we're willingly doing this. But that doesn't mean, I mean, it's an illustration of how strong this is. And so even when in a con we're not willing to do it, where it's not a magic show, we don't realize what's happening, that doesn't make the psychology any less potent. I think those same principles, those same beliefs, that same kind of desire to believe is still incredibly strong when you leave the magic arena. So yes, I think that it's not just a good parallel, but helps explain why a lot of it happens the way that it happens. And even if that's one of the reasons that I say, when people are like, well, what's my, give me a how to, I want a 10-point list for how to avoid being conned. And I say, I'm sorry, I can't because it's impossible. It's such a fundamental part of the way that our minds work is that you can be aware of it, but awareness is certainly a tool, but it's not total protective armor.
So where does this thing come from? Like, at what point in society were we like, okay, people want to be together, and I totally agree with that. I think there's a reason we have cities and states
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
countries. I understand that there's a desire for individuals to have more than someone else. I think I get that. But where were we in society where we were like, I need to, in some form, I mean, I'll call it violent because it's psychologically violent, do this to somebody else. So we understand tons have been written about killing and why we hurt each other and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But this con thing is the one that fascinates me the most. Like, why do we do this to one another?
Well, I think that the crucial thing to understand, and one that it took me a while to understand again, after I spent 3 years with con artists, is that it's not we. So we are all victims. All people are possible victims of con artists, but not all of us are possible con artists. So you have to remember that this is a very, very small percentage of the population. Just like psychopaths, and some con artists are psychopaths. It's an evolutionarily beneficial strategy, psychopathy, as long as you're a minority, as long as you're a very small minority. Because if everyone trusts and most people aren't taking advantage of you, then if you're that one person who is taking advantage of others, you'll get away and you'll get ahead, and this will be very beneficial. Now, if everyone starts doing it, all of a sudden no one trusts anyone and you're worse off than you were before. It's this typical kind of game theoretical type of framework when you apply it to, well, what kind of a strategy is going to be beneficial from my evolutionary survival, and my maximum gain. And so I think the answer is that most people don't. Most people really don't take advantage of others. And some people see that. Some people see that and say, okay, here's an opening for me. They're predators. It's like in any food chain, you have some predators, and con artists are predators. They see, they analyze, and they figure out, okay, this is how I get ahead. And I write about the dark triad of traits in my book, and that's psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, which a lot of con artists do possess. Not all of them, of course, and not all have all three, but that is kind of the type of mindset that most people, I would hope, don't have. But the psychopathy means that you don't feel some sympathy for your victims because you don't experience emotions the way that other people do. The narcissism makes you feel entitled, so you can justify taking something from someone else because you think you deserve it more. And the Machiavellianism gives you the tools to do it. You're someone who's Machiavelli's ideal prince. You can persuade people. You can manipulate people without their realizing they're being manipulated. Take those three together and you have the person who not only can take advantage of others, but justifies taking advantage of others. Most of us, it breaks down somewhere. We can, but we can't justify it. We can justify it, but we're bad at doing it. Somewhere in there, we're going to have either a moral dilemma or just a execution dilemma. Con artists are the people for whom all of that aligns.
So there's also this fine line, and I mean, it is sort of very illuminating for me to hear you say that you need these con artists because it's part of that evolutionary process. It's part of the tree of life, and I get that, and I'm sort of nodding here, going, yeah. And as I think of con artists, I'm thinking of the person on the street, or even a more sophisticated one. The part where I'm like, yeah, but is I feel like when I
Mm-hmm.
look a lot of the major businesses that we have and infrastructures we have, and I think Wall Street is one that people are definitely have in
Yeah.
their bullseye. You can see a movie like The Big Short or read the work of Michael Lewis and think,
Mm-hmm.
wow, we've almost accepted that that entire system is based on that, and we can't do anything about it. There's not much we
Mm-hmm.
can do, and that there's a side that is legal, and then there's a side of people like Bernie Madoff and others who expose it on top of how it's already exposing people. And again, I'm not asking you to comment on whether or not the entire infrastructure of our global economic power is based off of a con game, but it certainly feels that way to most people, that it's laws upon laws and people building this upon their own benefit and not for the masses.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, there are, as you say, I mean, it's not even a fine line. I mean, it's just like this fungible barrier between people we dismiss as con artists and people we say are legitimate. And David Moore, whose work I quote extensively in my own book, he wrote this wonderful book in 1940 called The Big Con. That I highly recommend to anyone and everyone who's interested in this. He was a linguist. He spent many years with con artists learning about, how they speak, how they operate. And he writes that if con artists are outside our society, we do well to remember that they aren't much further outside it than people we consider pillars of society.
Mm.
And you see a lot of the same tricks and a lot of the same characteristics and a lot of the same tactics in business, in law, in media, in marketing, in advertising. I mean, so many different walks of life, anywhere where people are using persuasive tactics. And so, yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's a question of intention. Do you have nefarious intent? Are you really looking to take advantage of other people? Are you looking to deceive? In which case you're a con artist, and they're con artists. Con artists sometimes have legitimate professions. The first snake oil salesman was in advertising, and he was selling snake oil, and he knew he was selling snake oil. So that makes him a con artist. If you're, if someone working for some ad agency and you're selling a soap and you realize that, sure, I'm going to exaggerate, I'm going to make some claims, I realize this is not going to make you look 10 years younger, but you're not malicious, you're not trying to deceive people. and take advantage of them. You really do think that this soap is good, and their lives will be slightly better. Yeah, they might not look 10 years younger, but there's some benefit. Their skin will be softer. Other stuff will happen. And so then you're a legitimate part of your profession. You're not a con artist. And so you have to keep doing that kind of calculus. And it gets blurry. There are definite, especially when you look at some places like finance, that is one that you mentioned, and I think is top of a lot of people's minds. You say, hey, isn't this the same thing? Well, yes and no. It really does depend. But it's easy to dismiss everyone as a con artist and to dismiss every member of some professions as con artists. But I don't think that's useful. I think that then the word loses all power.
So this is where I'm so curious by it. And I think that really ultimately people buy your book and are buying into this conversation because it's even a line. We love a good con. I mean, people really do love it as long as it's not happening to them. We like
Right.
deception. We like mystery. We like games. We like, when you're sort of seeing it as a voyeur, there's something very romantic about it. And yet, if you think about what you want the outcome to be, you want it to be power, you want it to be profit, you want it to be fame. What I find fascinating is because you look at people like, ones you mentioned in the book, Lance Armstrong or Bernie Madoff, and it feels like they could have had either all three of those or all three of those without the deception. And yet,
Yeah.
that I think that's the one that really gets people. It's like
Yeah.
you could have done it without doing that. So why spend all of those years, all of that effort, all of that energy in the end for it to be that?
Absolutely. I think that is such a crucial question because most con artists are incredibly intelligent and could have been incredibly successful in a very wide array of careers. So why did they go this illegitimate route? And I think that actually gets at the heart of what motivates con artists. And the answer is not money. So people always think that con artists are motivated by money, and that's why one of the things that I try to do in the book is to actually write a lot about con artists who didn't make that much money, who didn't make any money. Some of them were always close to bankrupt, and it was just a question of other things. Because I think it's really important to understand that the motivation is about power. It's about power over other people.
But they have power. They
And
had tremendous
so,
power.
well, so they do, but it's this rush of knowing. Like it's almost like addiction. So you get away with it, right? You know that you have power over other people, and you know that you got away with something and no one noticed, and that increases your power even more. And so I think they become addicted to that thrill, to that kind of rush of knowing that you are pulling one over and that you're getting away clean. And so a lot of them, they start small and then they get away with it, and then they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then they have opportunities to go straight and they don't take them. So I write about Ferdinand Waldo de Mara, the great imposter. He loves, or loved, he died about 20 years ago, a little more. He loved to tell people that, I would have gone straight if I had just had the opportunity. This is the way that life works out, blah, blah, blah. People believed him, including his biographer, who were very sympathetic and said, yeah, this is a good guy. He would have gone straight. He had so many opportunities to go straight. They were handed to him because he became quite popular. He was on Groucho Marx's show. He had a lot of legitimate kind of opportunities, and he turned them all down ultimately. And when he did take one, he would at the end take advantage of it and then turn right back to being a con artist, because there is something about that is even more, it's even more of a sense of power and control, because you really are changing. It's not just that people admire you in the case of Lance Armstrong, but that you are messing with them, that you're controlling their outcomes, and they have no idea.
And so I'm really curious because you mentioned the word trust, and you can't talk about cons and even Sherlock Holmes without trust. I mean,
Yeah,
the trust is like a fundamental thing. I come
absolutely.
from that terrible snake oil world of advertising and marketing. What's fascinating, I think, about my journey is that I launched this agency in 2000, and my real passion for it, having done media and publishing and magazines prior to that, and again, more
Mm-hmm.
entertainment, so less of the sort of shilling on the bad stuff, was just that I felt that digital really embraced more openness, right? Social media was
Mm-hmm.
just coming into fruition. We had the ability for, what I would call human interactions between human beings, like brands could really interact
Yep.
with people and back and forth. And if they were put offside, there were now forums, Facebook, other places where they could be exposed for the world to see. If someone did a search, they would find them. And there was a lot of the word trust in the early
Mm-hmm.
2000s, even up until now, about what brands need to do. Now, I jokingly say that brands had to be dragged into social media kicking and screaming. They weren't like open to doing this, they were forced into it, and here we are. And I think there's a lot of sentiment in the world today that we live in a very high trust world. But as I was reading your book and thinking more deeply about the topic of conversation we were going to have and the world of marketing and business that I'm in, I felt
Mm-hmm.
that might be the greatest con going, is that people think we live in this high trust world and transparent, and you can't screw me over because it would be public. But actually, more than ever, we're falling for it, and I feel like there might be an even lower sentiment of trust because of what this technology has brought. Am I rambling, or am I into a good point
No,
here?
you're onto a really good point. So Frank Abagnale, who people might know as Leonardo DiCaprio in Catch Me If You Can, he was asked recently about whether he could pull off some of his scams today. There's so much technology, there's so much stuff that should really make things transparent. He just laughed at the question. He said, "Are you kidding? Cons have become a million times easier than they've ever been." And you hear that sentiment again and again. So I talked to this guy who used to be a hacker. He was a white hat hacker. So he was hired by companies to actually, hack into their systems to see what their points of vulnerability are. And now he's a neuroscientist. So he is hacking the brain. But he also has the same exact opinion, and he's still in touch with his old team, that technology makes all of this so much easier because it is a false sense of security. You are absolutely right that we think that all of these things make it easier. We can Google, we can look people up, we can protect ourselves. Not true, because the con artists can use this technology a million times better than we can. They can impersonate people. They can get so much information about us on social networks. I mean, we give up so much privacy every single time we open our computer. It doesn't even have to be signing on to Facebook or Twitter or anything like that, although those things certainly don't hurt. But every single interaction really makes us vulnerable because it becomes incredibly easy for people to gather data about us, to learn who we are, to learn the types of things we like, who our friends are, what we're like, and then they can take advantage of that. They can take advantage of us. We are so vulnerable every single time we go online, and we think we're so protected. We think that we'll be able really to really actually make any of this work in our favor. And we can't. We can't.
It's so depressing. I'm like, listen to you, this is so depressing. But look, I think the worst question someone can ask you, which you probably get asked multiple times a day, is why do we fall for it? So I'm not going to ask you that. Because the answer, I think part of the answer that you're trying to explore in the confidence game, and this is not just your work in psychology, but also you've done extensive work in the sciences as well, is that there's a science to the con. And again, when people hear that, they probably go, "Oh yeah, like it's a science in how it's structured to create that emotional reaction that makes the
Mm-hmm.
mark become the victim." But I
Mm-hmm.
actually don't think that. I think that there's an emotional side to it for sure, but there actually is a very scientific, pragmatic thing happening there that I feel like people don't even want to admit exists because then they can't blame it on the fact that I was emotionally vulnerable.
So what do you think that is? What do you think is the scientific thing that's going on? I'm
Well, it's
curious to hear your. I have an opinion too, but I'd love to hear what you think is the other kind of non-emotional element here.
what goes back to the magic trick. I can see how
Mm-hmm.
it's done, and I can watch them repeatedly do it and do the hide, do the manipulation, and still when they show it again, go, uh, the hand is faster than the eye. Like there's
Yep.
just things happening in our body that no
Yep.
matter what happens, you're gonna
Yeah.
see it the same way a million times.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. And I think the other part of it, which I mean, you can say it's emotional, but I would say that it's actually even kind of deeper than emotion, is that we really, as human beings, do have a very deep need for belief. And I think this is the reason why we like magic. It's also the reason why we're so vulnerable to con artists. I mean, we are so uncomfortable. Our minds are uncomfortable with uncertainty, with ambiguity, with shades of gray. I mean, we really don't function in a world where there's kind of no cause and
Or
effect.
black and
And
white.
exactly, no black and white, where you can't draw those sorts of distinctions. It really makes us profoundly uncomfortable, and so we seek something that will address that will give us black and white. And con artists understand this, and they take advantage of it. I mean, they give us, this goes back to your earlier question about, why would anyone take advantage? Well, these are the types of people. They see, every single opening, there's someone who will take advantage of it, right? It's like loopholes and regulations. If there's a loophole, someone's going to jump through it. So people they can see others, and they can see that kind of, not even aversion isn't a strong enough word, but that just deep discomfort with all of these, with the messiness and the randomness of the world. And they say, okay, I'm going to give you a cleaner world, because that's a world you actually want to be true. And lo and behold, it is a world we want to be true. And so we listen to it, we believe it, because it's a world we want to believe. And sure, there's definitely an emotional component to it, but it's not, I don't think it's the same emotion that you were talking about when you say I was in a vulnerable state. I was very emotional, because it's the way we are all the time. And sure, certain circumstances can heighten that. When you experience loss, when something terrible happens and you're looking for meaning, by the way, that's a favorite time of con artists to strike, then it becomes amplified, but it's always there. And it's always there even in the con artists who understand it, which is why con artists can also be conned, which I think is a very important point. Everyone can.
And I think that's another interesting component. And I think you discussed that on Charlie Rose when you're on the show as well. This idea of how con artists talk about when they were conned as well.
No, it happens all the time. My favorite story is this guy named Oscar Hartzell, and this is the early 1900s. He ran the old Spanish prisoner fraud, and the Spanish prisoner is one of the oldest cons in the book. We have references to it dating back to at least the 1500s, although I think it existed much earlier. But this is just the first instance that historians have been able to find. And basically, the old Spanish prisoner is, there's a guy in prison. He's a Spanish prisoner. He's very wealthy. If you help get him out, if you help pay either for his bail or help bust him out, whatever the story happens to be, then he'll share his fortune with you. And so you'll put in a small investment, huge payoff. If it sounds familiar, it's because the same setup is used with the Nigerian prince. Help me wire, transfer my money, and all of a sudden you're a millionaire because I'm a Nigerian prince and I'm going to share my wealth with you. So this guy, Oscar Hartzell, had a very similar setup. He said, Sir Francis Drake, from your history, probably remember him as kind of the privateer pirate type of person under Queen Elizabeth, who sailed the high seas for her, explored, might have stolen a few ships and lots of treasure. So the story goes that Oscar told people that Sir Francis Drake dies without leaving a legitimate heir. And so there's this vast treasure that's just out there and that was never claimed. And so the British government kind of took it for itself, but they haven't been able to use it because it's not legally theirs. And there's a battle, and the battle has been going on for centuries, literally centuries, to free this treasure up. And it's almost there. There's just a little bit of bureaucratic red tape that's left. And so all you have to do is give a little bit of money to help cut through the red tape so that the treasure will finally be freed by Sir Francis Drake's descendants, and it will be shared by everyone who helped make it possible. This guy gets millions of dollars. He's really, really good at selling the story. People want to believe it. They keep giving him money. He finds himself in England. Well, he doesn't find himself in England. He wants to live in England for a while, and it's plausible. You need to be closer to the to the treasure. And he sees an ad in a newspaper. And the ad is for a seance. And he knows that, psychics are BS. That doesn't exist. There's something about this ad that kind of strikes his fancy. He says, ha ha, on a lark, I'm going to go. He goes to the seance and he comes to a profound realization. Psychics are BS, but this psychic is real.
Of course.
Of course. Everyone has the single psychic that's actually the real deal. And so he starts going to her. Now, she's really good at what she does. She hires a private investigator to follow this guy around. So then she finds out about this whole con that he's been running for almost a decade, starts blackmailing him as well, and also has all this information to feed him back, so he believes in her even more. Long story short, she gets hundreds of thousands of dollars. And once again, early 1900s, this is a lot of money out of him. And so he, this guy, this master con artist, gets conned by a psychic. I mean, a psychic.
Crazy. So
it's crazy, but it's not uncommon.
So this is the thing, right? And this is the dividing line. It's something you brought up before, which is people want to think they're being rational, even when it's happening to them. Mm-hmm. When you're doing this analysis of people, because I actually think the alignment between that and business is really close. Mm-hmm. Are there like one or two things where like that line of rational becomes like I have to cut rope now, or is it mostly go to the completion where it winds up in a bit of the victim world?
I think it mostly goes to completion. It's really hard. It's really hard to get out once you're in it. And this is actually one of the few practical tips that I can give from this book. And it actually comes from this woman who worked with at this point that he did it. He was the only one. I don't know if there are others right now. He was a professional cult infiltrator. So he would not just extract people from cults, but his rationale was that the only way to truly do this is to speak their language. If you're in a cult, then you're already brainwashed. You need to know exactly what that feels like. You need to know what the language is. You need to know kind of what's happening psychologically if you're going to get someone out. And so he did this professionally. He would help people. He used to be a lawyer. And then I'm speaking about him in the past tense because he unfortunately died of cancer a few years ago. But he would go in and he would get people out. He would actually infiltrate the cult, become a member, and then he could talk to people on their level and get them out of the cults. And he only failed once. So this woman worked with him because some cults you need to be female to infiltrate because that's exactly who they're looking for. They're looking for young women. And so I was able to speak with her a few times about, how do you do this? Because cults they're the ultimate con in a way. It's a spiritual con. It's your most profound beliefs about the world. And so I asked her, how do you survive? And she said that this was one of the most important lessons that this guy, David Sullivan, gave to her. And this is something that she had to use all the time. And it was actually two things. One, you have to have a very strong sense of self. And it has to be a sense of self that really is not at all dependent on the external world, and you have to keep reminding yourself of it because that's the first thing to go is your sense of self.
Are you? Sorry. I can translate that. Is that like do you define that as like the moral compass? Is that what you mean?
No, it's not a moral compass. It's knowing who you are, so that no one else can tell you who you are. I'm Mitch. This is what I do. These are the things that are important to me. So part of it is a moral compass, yes, but it's just like it's being very well grounded in who you are as a human being. What are the things? And yes, what are the things you will and won't do, which is the second part of it. She set limits, and you have to set limits ahead of time because she would see terrible things. She would see child abuse. She would see violence. She would see a lot of things happening in these cults that are really awful. And so you have to understand that to infiltrate, you have to go along with it to a certain extent, but then you have to set limits. You need to know how to get out of the situations. You need to have exit plans. And so she had exit plans always in place. Like if I don't check in by, this time, this is what you're going to do. So she had her husband, friends, different people, knowing exactly what was going on. And you always basically have to know how you're going to get out of any situation. If you're forced to abuse a child, how in advance, this is a terrible scenario to have to contemplate, but what are you going to do? How are you going to not blow your cover and be able to get the person that you need to get out? But you just can't do this. And so you actually think through these terrible scenarios so that you always have a plan of exit. And now let's remove that from cults and child abuse and all these horrible things. It's always good to have plans of exit, to know how to exit any situation with grace. Because a lot of times people get conned because they can't extricate themselves. And even at the beginning, when they are feeling uncomfortable, extricating would make them feel even more uncomfortable. It would seem like a loss of face. It would seem, like you're letting people down, a lot of different things.
It's not just a con, Maria. It could be a relationship. I mean,
Exactly.
it's just
Yes.
like,
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, think about how many bad relationships keep going because of inertia. So knowing what your limits are and having exit plans and never crossing something that's uncomfortable. So if you're in a business interaction and like, let's talk about real estate. People get very emotional about real estate. So imagine that you're buying a house and you say that your limit is $10. I'm just giving you a totally crazy number because I don't know what the market is like in Montreal, and I can't do.
we're going to go with basic math. Let's do it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's say your limit, you don't want to spend more than $10 to buy a house. And you say, this is my limit. Then someone bids against you and someone gives $11. And all of a sudden you're thinking, uh-oh, I really want this house. Am I going to go to 1150? And sometimes you do because it wasn't a real limit. You didn't commit yourself and you just you get caught up in the situation. Well, so then, you have to actually set a real limit. You have to say, this is my price. That's it. This is why in-person auctions are so powerful because people get caught up and don't exit the situation and they end up overpaying. They end up going above what they're comfortable with. This is why pre-commitment internet auctions are really great for people who don't want to overpay. You set your maximum ahead of time and you go away. You don't even know what's going on. And then at the end of the day, you'll know whether you won or not. But you definitely didn't go above that price. It's much more difficult to do this when we're not talking houses and auctions and actual finances, because there you can definitely say, this is my financial limit. But you have to think sometimes of human interactions in the same way. I'm not comfortable in a situation that starts going here. And then you'll find that you actually can extricate yourself, but you need to know how. Because a lot of times you don't feel comfortable, but you also you don't have a plan. You don't actually have a way of getting out. And people hate thinking through plans. People hate thinking, if this happens, then this happens. Peter Gollwitzer is a psychologist at NYU, and this is all of his research is goal implementation, if-then strategies. If it's raining, then I'm still going to go to the gym and I'm just going to bring an umbrella, those types of things. But it works really well for tricky, uncomfortable situations. We never want to think through it. We always think that we'll know the if-then when we come to it. We won't. And it's just really good to have those ahead of time. That can be incredibly helpful.
Last thing I'm curious about, you mentioned it earlier, but just to conclude and pull it all together, there is some thinking that the people who fall for what I'll call the bigger cons, the ones that take place over longer periods of time and that involve sort of siphoning of resources, whether it's monetary power or otherwise, is that there is an alignment on the victim side or the mark side between those who take risks and those who are risk adverse. Is there something to that, or is that completely false?
No, there actually is something to that. Now, if you're risk averse, you still might fall for a con. You just will fall for a different type of con. But risk-seeking behavior is definitely something that's associated with cons, and certain elements of your life may actually make you risk-seeking, no matter what. So you might be really risk averse in general. But we've talked a little bit about, experiencing loss and having kind of emotional instability in the wake of that. there's a lot of research that shows that when that happens, you actually become more risk-seeking. You become more tolerant of losses because you're trying to compensate, and so that brings out kind of your inner risk seeker. So there's definitely something to it. It's not an either or proposition. It's not like you're risk-seeking or not. It's all situationally dependent, which I think a lot of kind of personality psychology misses. They say, "Oh, I'm risk-seeking." Well, I'm risk-seeking in certain situations. I'm risk-averse in other situations, right? Everyone has a behavioral profile. And so as long as that behavioral profile at the moment ends up lining up, then you become more vulnerable. That said, it's not a necessary condition. So you can be very, very risk averse in absolutely every single part of your life, and you still become vulnerable to one specific type of con. So I hate giving you a messy answer, but
I
but
love it.
unfortunately, it's not neat.
I love it. Maria, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. I find that the link between what you're doing in psychology, culture, science, and for us, it's a business audience. They're so
Mm-hmm.
intrinsically connected. So thanks so much for your time. Let people know where they can connect to your work online.
You can connect to my website. That's just mariakonnikova.com, or I'm on Twitter at mkonnikova.
Thank you so much, Maria.
Thank you so much, Mitch. It's been a pleasure.